Good Monday to you all. I hope you had a fabulous weekend. Mine was about half fabulous and about half crap, but we're just going to go with it and try to make it a better weekend next weekend. When I was about 32, I left my parents for the first time. It was due to my father disrespecting me for some reason that I do not really remember. But be sure that it was serious, and I was beginning to get tired of him being so disrespectful of me still in my 30s. My wife and I had gone to my mother to discuss how my father was treating us in order to work the problem out somehow. After a good deal of arguing with no progress, I mentioned something my father had done to me. Just some random fact to see if I could get her to relate somehow. When my mother heard it, she put her hand to her face to make it obvious that she snickered, like it was amusing to her. I could not believe it. I did not say another word. I just looked at my wife, confused, stood up, and laughed. I woke the next day to an email from my mother speaking of my emotional tirade, as she put it, and taking shots at my wife for backing me up. I later learned it was that day that my mother decided she did not like my wife anymore, all because she was trying to help her husband with a serious problem. To the best of my knowledge, I do not believe we said anything derogatory or raised a bunch of hell. My mother was simply not accustomed to me speaking my mind about issues such as that or standing up for myself. I'm sure I did lose my temper or raise my voice. I will concede to that. I'm positive I wasn't mean to my mother. That's just not typical of my personality. The first 6 months or so that I was estranged from my mother and father was difficult, and I had made some progress. I caved around Thanksgiving and decided to give a relationship with them another shot. Within a year, I was gone again for most of the same reasons, but then I started to realize my mother had her part in it as well. I recall the whole cell phone game very well. My mother easily convinced me to get in a contract with her and then held it over our heads, turning them off, then back on, while enjoying the delight in harassing us about our payment every month. I fell for that, a few different contracts, because she promised me how great it was all going to be and then used it as a tool to manipulate me. Once we would start to argue about some random topic, as people often do, she would use the cell phone contract as ammunition. It appears the contract had some hidden clauses. I missed the part where it was contingent on me staying around and following a certain protocol of which I was not aware. Perhaps my mother could have had the common decency to not hide these requisites from me, but that would have defeated the purpose of control. For decades, my mother harped over and over about how much of a liar my sister's been. It turns out the narrative was only to cover up her own lies. When things did not go exactly her way, she lies to her heart's content, jumps the fence back and forth wherever it's convenient for her, and has used my sister as a cover for her own character deficits. True as that statement is, it's crazy to see it on paper. I found myself in need of a car at one point. I mentioned it to my father in passing. I should have known better, but I always fell for it. He became obsessed, as he always did, about everything, and now it's his mission to buy me a car. I did my best to talk him out of it, but he muscled his way in, as he always did, constantly hounding until he showed up with a car one day or whatever angle he decided. I tried to avoid it all, but eventually I agreed, and he bought me a broken car once again. It happened a few times before. My graduation present was a total wreck that he picked out. He didn't agree with the car I wanted. It didn't get great gas mileage. We paid off the car on schedule. We knew that some kind of manipulation was coming if we didn't. I was confused because I never intended him to buy me a car in the first place. Let's not forget about how my wife wrecked that very car, and you made sure that you replied with, "Is the car okay?" and not her. This is a perfect example of my mother's work. Over time, she will methodically manipulate guilt-laden comments, insensitivity, sensitivity when it works to her advantage, or complete belligerence. That type of behavior is noticed, and I'm well schooled in this game. My parents taught me all the angles. I noticed every time my parents played a psychological game with me, and I watched you abuse and manipulate my sister via email for years. I didn't say much and was a yes man for many years. But I logged all these events in my mind. I know the difference between right and wrong, even though my parents skewed my vision of the world for their own needs. I probably added this particular paragraph, like a thing to note about all these things, like these last few paragraphs that I put in. It's hard to say when they were written. They could have. I could have waited. Most likely, I waited a year or more to write more, because I'm not very diligent when it comes out, and I hadn't been. It's just when things would come up, I would kind of like need to put things down on paper and to kind of defrag everything in my mind about what goes on. Even now, when I go through this now, it like kind of brings it up, and it doesn't make it fresh because I'm so like totally over this stuff because I've been through it so much. But it brings it up, and it's kind of interesting to look at now later because I forgot about a few of these things that probably should have been remembered. So when I talk about leaving my parents for the first time, I think that was actually the first time when I was 32 years old, when I finally got fed up. And I remember that being that way. I had dealt with from 0 to 30, around 30 or something. I had dealt with everything that they had dealt to me, and I could just go on for hours. And I actually do go on for hours. And you'll hear a lot of the things that they did to me because I detailed them out. But it, it I really remember getting tired. Just dad, like he made some comment to me, and I just said, you know what? I probably didn't say anything to him at that point because I was still pretty scared of him at that point. I was still relatively young, and I went to mom. That's when I got up here going to mom, and I actually got with my wife, and we talked about it the day before, and I actually sat down with mom, and like, mom, like this is getting like to be a lot, like he's a real dick, we were starting to get into the meat of it, and I was just starting to fight back, and I really thought. Like I say a little bit earlier, I'm actually, I'm sure that it got heated, and I'm sure I also didn't call my mother names or do anything like super manipulative of her in that point. I was really just trying to kind of hash it out, but that's when it brought up that I said something about something that dad did. I think maybe even to Cody or something, just something real rude, dad, and she was like, she was so laughed. And you just have to know my mom. She is just, oh my God, if it was your mom, you'd just cringe, and you'd freak out. You wouldn't believe that your mom was doing that to you. So I had left, and then apparently here, and I totally forget this stuff, that the first 6 months that I was estranged was good, and I had made some progress, but then around Thanksgiving, I went back. And then it looks to me by the end of the year that it happened again, I left again. And then I had brought up this cell phone contract thing. So probably within that year, that's when the cell phone thing, because I probably came back and mom said, hey, we all need a cell phone and they're cheap and I can get this deal or whatever, and why don't we all get the same contract? And I fell for that, I think, twice, because I could afford it, and she would always kind of act like I couldn't, and she was getting me to think that I couldn't get one. She was like, I don't think you can get one because your credit ain't good enough. And I would do it, and then we'd have an argument or something wouldn't go her way. I wouldn't acknowledge something that I was supposed to or whatever, and then even though I'd be paying the bill, which I always did, and everything was fine and not taking advantage of it, she would do something. She would come back and say something about the payment, like the payment was hung up, or did you give me that check? I forget. It just depends on what she wanted to do that particular day. So she brought my sister into it too. The narrative was always that my sister was lying and that it was mom and dad were liars, and they just chose Melissa as the scapegoat so they could just kind of go through scot-free and do anything they wanted. And then, of course, when my dad bought me a car, he bought me a few different cars, and I fell for that a couple times the same way I did with mom with things, and they were never expensive, but mom or dad bought me two cars on two different occasions. My graduation present car was okay. It was a 280ZX. It was rusty. It was bondoed, and it just eventually went bad pretty quick. And I didn't get what I wanted for my graduation present, so that's why I was upset about that. But I appreciated it. And then within a few years, it was down. And then later, I didn't even really need one. And he's like, there's this car here, and it's like 2000. And we went to South Springfield and bought it off of just some sketchy dude. And it turned out he'd put tape over the engine lights and stuff, So it's just the wildest, most surreal thing with this, how mom and dad would do things. It was almost like dad was trying to, make it so money would fix it, but he'd screw up the problem or he'd screw up the situation so bad and buy a crap car, and he'd get mad if you'd say it was a crap car, and then mom would be manipulating the whole time. So, the plot thickens. Stay tuned for more, because there's a ton more where that came from.